The next special lecture will be given by Professor Saibal on economic policies and the role of information. Now, few words about Professor Saibal. Professor Kaur is the RBI Chair Professor of Economics at the Center for Social Science, Center for Social Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, CSSSC, and a research fellow of the Institute of Labor Economics, Germany. He has been a professor of economics at Calcutta University and a fellow of prestigious Alexander von Humboldt Foundation during 2008-2009. So he held visiting positions at the Amsterdam School of Economics, Santa Fe Institute, Hamburg University, United Nations University, etc. in recent years. He is the managing editor, South Asian Journal of Macroeconomics and Public Finance, SAGE. He also serves as the director of Eastern Regional Center of IISSRI. He has published many papers in national and international journals. So this session, as said by Professor Chakraborty, will be chaired by Professor Indrani Chakraborty. So I would like to invite Professor Saibal Kaur. Sir, please. And Professor Indrani Chakraborty, if you can chair the session. You want to say some words?
Thank you. I invite Professor Saibal Kaur for the lecture on economic policies and the role of information.
So let me profusely thank Professor Achin Chakraborty and the and Mr. Sanjay Kaur, as also the chairperson for this session, for inviting me to this conference, which I would normally avoid coming to because it's really not my domain in the first place, because library and digital science or dealing with data, the repositories, is something that we are the end users of, but not exactly into the making of it. So I would normally say, no, this is not my area of expertise at all, and I would have very little to say about anything in this regard. But yet I kind of agreed to, when Professor Chakraborty initially told me about this idea, I said, yes, you see, we deal with information all the time, and there are a lot of worries, and I fear that some of the things that I'm going to show and tell you about would actually converge with what Dr. Rajakumar has been saying, and it essentially borderlines on the litany of O's that the social scientists usually have about data in India, right? So I'll show you some of these issues, but essentially I would take it from one aspect of where the information really impinges on the performance of an academic, and particularly those of an economist, because you see, if it's about information, we take it as the most important source of whatever we do in terms of research, because unless we have a continuous and uninterrupted flow of information supporting our ideas and thoughts and giving us the due motivation for theoretical and analytical purposes, we are completely blinded by abstractism about what we are trying to say. So it has become more and more a process, and I'll tell you some of the personal experiences as well, because as Professor Chakraborty initially said, that gone are the days that we spend hours and hours in the libraries, sifting through data and volumes of information on the journals and so on and so forth, because it's all out there somewhere. We can see from the databases online, and particularly during the COVID time, you can imagine where would we have gone if the libraries were all closed, if all the sources of information where we usually jump upon are completely beyond our access, right? The only thing that we survived upon is these online sources of information, whether it's from EPW Foundation, which is so useful. I'm going to talk about that, and who else would be not talking about EPW Foundation as being a researcher stationed in India. It doesn't have to be about Indian data and Indian economics as such, but we cannot miss information sources such as EPW Foundation provides on a regular basis. But my point of entry into this issue comes from a slightly different angle. And if you would permit a few slides of why information is important for us and why we keep on asking about the quality of information, quality of data, which becomes information on the hands of the researcher. One of the major issues is about the economic uncertainty. And I completely understand if you are not, willing to go into these questions, which is typically an economics question or economics issue, generally speaking. But it's just to tell you that you see more information sometimes actually helps us ride over the uncertainties we face all around. And there should be little doubt that we do face uncertainties in everything around us, whether it's what's going to happen with the disease prevention, how we're going to survive the next economic crisis. Are there going to be more wars all around? This is all about the information flow and leading to uncertainties of which we have very little idea. The same way as we cannot predict earthquakes, we cannot predict tsunamis, we cannot predict eventualities in the next few years unless we have good information supporting us with these procedures that arrange data for information and for giving us a better way to understand how economy and society performs. So these the examples that I put here, it's basically to say that the interest in economic policy uncertainty actually comes from the claim that it played a great role in the recession and recovery that we have gone through, say, way back from 2008-9, and again in 2019-20, where people keep on saying that there has been a serious recession due to COVID, but the recovery has been slow, right? It's not been a V all the way. It's been a steep down slope and a relatively slow recovery, like a phased out U going up. So what is that speed of recovery? Is that information based? Can we use the existing information? Can we collect more information? Can we collect more data and get back into the same the way of life that used to be before the crisis happened? Are all dependent on the flow of information and how uninterrupted that flow of information is, right? So for example, the Federal Open Market Committee, IMF, together, they claim that uncertainty about tax, spending, regulatory and monetary policies, because I also work closely with RBI policies, I know that the fluctuations in RBI policies from time to time, whether the repo rate is going to go up, whether your EMIs are going to go up or go down in the next 6 months is something that we can't tell for sure, right? So it has to be based on what has been the procedures before, what has been the trend already available to us. Are we all aware of it? Are we all aware of it on time? Is an important way of looking at why information really affects our decision-making procedures, decision-making abilities. So the recent financial and real turmoil highlighted the importance of stable, predictable and effective economic policies. Okay. And restricted information flow actually accentuates and does not subdue negative sentiments regarding economic uncertainties. So there is a tendency, we all know of this, that we sanction information. We stop information flow, right? If there's a crisis, if there's a riot, we immediately stop information from flowing to anybody, because there's a perception that if there's no information, people would just go back home and do nothing. Right? And everything comes back to normalcy. Is it really the case, or it makes people more jittery? It makes people more anxious about what's going to happen next. So it's not very clear as to whether information flow should be really hindered or let it flow and people decide on their own. It's an open question for that matter. So I'm not going to refer papers here, but this has all been the cases with the US example. And I particularly mention one thing because it really affects even today the way Professor Ben Bernanke got his Nobel Prize last year. And again, if you're not interested in economics, don't be. I'm just giving you information for that matter. But it's just to tell you that Ben Bernanke announced something in 2013 after United States and the whole world was coming out of the global crisis of the mortgage-related problems that started in 2008 and 9. And he made a peculiar announcement. He said that United States is going to stop supporting all the private companies that went down during the crisis, and the kind of support they were getting from the Federal Reserve would be stopped, which means that now they will have to collect resources on their own, and they would be willing to raise the interest rates back in United States, so in order to attract funds to keep their companies running. Simple, right? Just commonsensical. what immediately happened is that, and there was no information for most of the developing countries in that regard, that money, foreign currency actually started flowing out of India and South Asian countries as soon as that information was out in United States. So it's not just information that stays within the boundaries of one country and affects their economy and society, but it's a cross-border spillover effect of information, which we all need to understand at some point, and we need support from the repositories of information and data to keep us aware of these things. That's where, the second part of my talk briefly, and Indra, please tell me 5 minutes before time. So by traditional measures, the stock market volatility index, that goes out the time, and in New York Times, basically talking about how uncertainty and economic activities are affected, and really changes with employment, productivity, consumption, investment, these all get affected. And this is something also Dr. Rajakumar was talking about, because these are information that all national agencies, whether it's a National Sample Survey or the US Labor Bureau or the Minnesota population survey, all collect on a regular basis. The problem with India comes from a different source, that we cannot get hold of this data when we are using Indian data repositories. But then we have to go to either World Development Indicators, or we have to go to OECD statistics, or we have to go to some extra national agencies to get data on India on more wider variety. Or you can even go to Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, which keeps on providing sub-annual data for various macroeconomic variables for India, which is impossible to collect from one source when you are using Indian databases. Anyway, so like I said, we all talk about litany of O's when it comes to Indian data, and some of these are also misplaced to an extent. I'm going to give you some shining issues on this matter also. So for example, NASDAQ, I think Ramesh Babu is probably here from NASDAQ, and we are really thankful to NASDAQ in various ways, because I'm also an IISSRI institution. I do come from an IISSRI institution, which makes me close to the same ideology and the ideas that IDSK itself pursues and excels in. So we share similar kind of backgrounds with with sourcing data and using it for development related questions to be explored at our doorstep. So NASDAQ offers a good source, but other sources of information, as you know, Ochinda wrote about it long time back also, it's drying up, okay? It's probably given to sources which are, to quote Dr. Rajakumar, private sources, but also not comprehensive. Mind you, it's an important thing that the way NSSO used to collect data, the CSO used to collect data, the coverage, the extent, and the depth with which data was covered, data was collected and disseminated is hardly the case with CMIE. Particularly during the COVID times, I've been following the unemployment situation almost every month, because you have to keep on reporting on what unemployment situation comes out after the COVID hits some of the unorganized sector workers in India. And the only data source you hear of is 5,000 sample bases collected by CMIE. Now you can imagine 5,000 workers from an Indian perspective is what, right? Does it represent anything for the Indian labor market at all? But that's the only source you have, because India government doesn't provide the adequate sources about looking at what's happening across states, what's happening across the entire country. So this is the best you can do at the worst time possible. So and added to that are comments made even in the economic surveys. It says that, for instance, and this is a direct excerpt from the Economic Survey of 2019, which says that while the monsoon impacts economic activity, policymakers have absolutely no control over it. And this goes back to the question of the uncertainty I was talking about. I was using it as an entry into this particular question. However, economic policy uncertainty captures uncertainty that policymakers can control. Now, all of us here would immediately think that, what about the environmental damages that various economic policies do? right? And I say that I have no control over the economic policies that affects the environment because I'll take the environmental uncertainties as something which is completely exogenous. Is that correct? It's definitely not, because it's, you know, in today's world you call it, in my parlance, and pardon me for using it, I call it endogenous. Everything is related to something else, and you cannot really say that environmental policies are not the making of, you know, national policies of India or Brazil or Ghana or United States. They are all part of it. You know, United States walking out of Paris Convention would have a lot to do with how environmental policies and environmental impacts affect your own domestic policies. Then how can you say it's all exogenous, right? So there are misleading information also going about, which makes it important for us, and particularly those in charge of repositories of information in the library sciences, to keep informing us back as researchers that, you know, you are missing out the connection. You need to tell that it's not just the information that the macroeconomic variables are of importance, but it's also about the environmental concerns that you need to tell us all the time, that you need to collect and use from a regular basis. So as I was telling, NSSO network is still a quite advanced source of data collection, both in terms of quantity and reliability of the data. And the other reason I forgot to mention in the beginning, I agreed to speak here, is that I once spoke, I spoke at NSSO several times, but this one was at NSSO office in Dunlop, where Professor Mahalanobish's birthday centenary was being celebrated. And I had to talk a little bit about how economists use the data, which is extremely important from the perspective of NSSO, because they need to have end users also. You know, you collect the data, and you know, unless somebody is using the statistics, it's futile to collect the data, right? So economists, statisticians, sociologists, political theorists, and political scientists all use data the best possible way one would expect. So we can be complacent that NSSO provides us with enough data, but there are, you know, crowning glories for us, and this is also to do with EPW Foundation. Just the first paragraph on the slide, what you see up here is that the American Economic Review, which is the top journal in economics, they published a paper using ASI data, right? And I was actually surprised that the author wrote that this is the most novel data set in India, right? We have been using ASI data set for a long time, never felt it was very novel, because it was a curation of data which was being published on an annual basis, but never on a time series, or more like a panel which we use to understand a particular issue much more comprehensively. Which a panel is something, you know, in case you do not know, it's a cross section of data. So all of us are counted, right? All the individuals, all the households are on the parallel you know, setup, but also we are tracked over a period of time. So it's not just yesterday, but it's day before yesterday, and, you know, the month before that, the year before that. So it's a longitudinal data with a cross section, which makes the data very comprehensive and useful, right? That's what ASI does. And that's probably the only novel data set for India, because it's ready, you can use it, you can make a lot of predictions on the basis of that. You can talk about employment, you can talk about you know, factory level investment, you can talk about wages, you can talk about salaries of non-factory workers, and so many things from ASI data, right? So I thought this was a great thing for the agency and those who actually curate the data to make it user friendly. But, you know, that's not going to be the cherry on the cake, because now, as I was mentioning in the beginning, information is power, in the sense that if you have very specific information, you can ensure publication in the best possible journals, right? So you have individually collected micro data, right? You showcase that data, make it believable. I had my own share of problems. We worked a lot on collecting private data, but then responses came from some of the better journals that this data is not believable because it's collected by private sources or individuals in India. Data has to be collected by individual sources. You know, if you collect individual data in United States, that's very believable. But if you collect it in India, it's all laced with problem. Or if you collect it in China, it's not credible at all. You know, that's also a mindset that the repositories of information should actually fight every moment, because otherwise we would not make our ways into some of these top journals. So that keeps going. So for example, Journal of Development Economics, another well-known journal in our field. Large number of papers are based on microdata. Okay. Sorry. So individuals go collect data or run experiments. Okay, and that gives them power to publish in those journals, where ASI or nationalized data coming from World Development Indicators or Reserve Bank of India collections would not be sufficient to make an interesting, incisive point about the changes in the development patterns or trajectories. So anyway, I would, this is just my continuation of what Dr. Rajakumar said, that once the data is priced, yeah, it runs a risk of creating more inequality in terms of what researchers can do, because if you are in a resource-rich location, resource-rich university and institution, right, you can access those data, you can make it useful for your own research. But if you are in typical public institutions and public universities with very little money to even pay salaries, you forget about buying those data, right? So what happens? It creates a clear divergence between researchers in terms of what you can do. But I would try to answer your question that journals do not ask where you got the data. You can have a friend from one of those rich universities who can collect the data for you, if he or she would do, right? Make him or her a co-author, right? And then use the data for publication. We always do that. I mean, why do you have so many co-authors in the United States and other places? Because they pay our submission fees. Yeah, you know, let's be honest about it. So public institutions might fall behind, creating more divergence in the outcomes. But we have to create some resources, and that again depends on the professionals in library science, that push your director, keep some money out, you know, don't waste and don't use it on, I'm not saying wastage, but you don't use it on other things, but keep some money there for enriching the library resources. ICSR does that all the time, providing host institutions with some money, so that's one way of looking at it. Big data analysis has come up in big ways, where informations like, I'm not going to read through all of these things, but you see the sentimental analysis are becoming more and more important for researchers to use. And if the library professionals can inform the researchers back about the sources of such data, where these things are collected and utilized, I think the research would gain extremely from these sources. So overall, it seems that information collection magnets will have to be in place at all times. There is no way we can put our guards down, because information is coming out more rapidly than we can ever imagine. Can we you know, attract all those information so quickly that our researchers benefit from it? So repositories must push for resource allocation towards this purpose. And I just mentioned one of these things. We made it a point, it just started a few months or maybe a year maximum, that whenever we are collecting primary data, we are budgeting a portion that the data would be given to archiving, because we do also at the Center for Studies, we have a very good archive of historical data, and they do not do with contemporary data, but at least they know how to archive information and data much better than we researchers do. So we made it a point that our proposals would go out with a section of the budgeting, you know, really kept aside for giving the data back to the archives, so that they can maintain and collect and maybe make it useful for future researchers. Its cross-sectional data would not be, you know, too in-depth in terms of the time variations in it, but cross-section data are quite useful, because I remember several cases, and we lost the data because nobody kept hold of it. DFID, you know the name perhaps, actually funded a 40,000 household data collection to Center for Studies, right? We collected the data for over 2 years across all West Bengal, 40,000 households. You can imagine that's a wealth of information. If you ask me where the data is, I cannot tell you, because we didn't keep a hold on how the data is maintained and you know, preserved, right? So that's what I'm at least trying to do, and I'm keeping the budget aside, giving it back to the archive, so that they can keep the money useful for preserving the data. I think that's something, so if I keep on doing, even on at an individual institutional level, might support some of the larger efforts at creating databases for the country. Thank you so much.